Okay. All right. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for discussion, communicating your research in the era of social media. My name is Nick Zhang, and I am a third-year material science and engineering PhD student at Hopkins. And it is my great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. So as we know, technology has been developed so rapidly in recent years. Social media tools such as Twitter, LinkedIn, or even TikTok have walked into our daily life. Particularly due to COVID-19, lockdown and isolations really made all this social media stand out. But with all these tools, how can we leverage this platform to share your life, your research, or just stay engaged when in-person activities just not available? So today, we are very happy to have three awesome panelists joining us, talking about their experiences of using social media and how they use it to communicate their work to the public. So first, we have Dr. Chris Gunter, a senior advisor for genomic engagement at the National Human Genome Research Institute and the head of engagement method units in the social behavior research branch. And then we have Dr. Jason Organ, who is an associate professor of anatomy, cell biology, physiology at the Indiana University School of Medicine. Lastly, we have Dr. Deepthi Murali, who is a research assistant professor at the Roy Rosenwick Center for the History and New Media at George Mason University. So welcome. Just a quick note for all our audience here today. Please feel free to ask your questions relevant to the discussion we have today. You can either type your questions in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself toward the end of discussion, which we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A sections. All right. So with that, let's start with today's discussion. To start, I want to ask each of the panelists to briefly talk about what do you do at work and what are some of the main social media platforms or tools you are using to communicate your work to the public. Let's start with Dr. Gunter.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I work now at NIH. I got here through a whole bunch of different jobs. So you can see behind me, I worked in publishing for a while and then worked at a nonprofit and did consulting and in academia. And now I find myself in government. So I say that to say it's been a lot of things going on. So in my current daily job, as Nick said earlier, I have two hats. My one hat is a senior advisor to the director of NHGRI, where I am responsible for helping to oversee the Twitter and social media and communications offices here. So if you've ever checked out the genome.gov Twitter account, you totally should, because it's specializing in memes and stuff. We have a lot of fun. And then I use Twitter myself a lot. I also have a small lab, and we do research into science communication and have a paper actually coming out next week about genetic literacy and how we look at that in terms of genetics. So the second part of your question was what I use. I use Twitter on a daily basis. I've just joined Mastodon, and we'll get into maybe how Twitter's imploding later. And I also have some LinkedIn, but for me, LinkedIn is, I don't really spend time on that. So.
All right. How about you, Deepthi?
Thank you, Nick, and thank you all for joining us. I am a research assistant professor and an art historian at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, as Nick said. I have, like Dr. Gunter, like sort of two different hats almost now in terms of research. One is I work on what is more sort of traditional art history, in that I still continue to work on what was my dissertation a couple of years back, which is on wood and ivory objects that were produced in South India and sort of in the broader Indian Ocean world, and that was circulated during the colonial period. So it has had direct impact because of colonialism and sort of courtly encounters, because a lot of these objects were produced for use in courts in various parts of India. And then it's also got to do with sort of ecological and environmental implications of colonialism, because wood and ivory were two of the most used materials that had direct impact because of deforestation, commercial plantations, and so on and so forth. So it's that kind of work still continues. But I also work at a Center for History and New Media now. So I'm also in digital humanities, and I work a lot with Indian textiles and looking at sort of how we can use digital methods to study the history of this very complex the first global commodity really, and how it was used as currency in trading in enslaved people, but also in sort of as produced by lower caste artisan groups in South India, and then how it actually became a global textile to the point that it actually, some people say, inspired industrial revolution. So I have a digital sort of thread to my work now that is very different from my more sort of older research materials. So if you ask me what I do, I get very confused very easily, as you can see. But what I actually do with social media is very different as well. As part of my DH work, I also do podcasting. So I produced a series for UIUC called the PhD Futures Now podcast. We had a season of it, and that's over now, but you can actually find it on phdfuturesnow.org, and which was about graduate education and sort of talking to different actors within the university. So we talked to everyone from deans to provosts to students and faculty about what are the challenges we face in graduate education. And I think of that as part of my research outreach, because I do use social media to kind of think about career diversity as part of my job. I graduated in 2020, so and in the humanities, and as an art historian, the lack of career options within academia is very front and center for me, and a lot of people who are in my generation of scholars. So part of my social media outreach also has to do with career diversity. And I use Twitter, but I also am more so on Instagram with that kind of work. But I also do podcasting and a little bit on LinkedIn. So those are sort of the social media channels I use.
Very interesting. All right. How about you, Dr. Hogan?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Excuse me. I have a cold, so I apologize if I sound like I have a frog in my throat today. As Nick mentioned, I am an associate professor of anatomy, cell biology, and physiology at the Indiana University School of Medicine. I wear multiple hats, like all of us do. My primary role is as a faculty member in my department. So I have a heavy role in teaching the next generation of healthcare providers all about the human body. And so that is an area that I actually learned when I was a grad student at Hopkins. And so I still carry forward the small little research lab that began as a student and postdoc at Hopkins in biomechanics. And so I'm interested in how the shapes of bones and muscles affect how well they work. And I learned about that initially in the context of evolution, and that was what fueled my research interests. But since I've been at IU for the last 10 years, my role has actually shifted more into the biomedical sphere. And so I study a disease called brittle bone disease, or osteogenesis imperfecta. And all of the sort of mechanics work that I learned when I was a student and postdoc at Hopkins, I now use instead of in an evolutionary context, more in a biomedical realm. But in 2017, as I was sitting around trying to figure out how I was going to maintain my lab in the face of threats to science that we hadn't seen before, I realized that there was something that I had been doing for a long time that could perhaps be a lot more useful for science with a capital S. Maybe not the science in my lab, but science with a capital S. And that is that I have been involved in science outreach and science communication for well over a decade. I got to start as a blogger. And there's actually kind of a funny story behind the blog that I really started working for initially, which was called The Scope. It's a blog about the intersection between science and popular culture. And I had been reading it as a postdoc and as an early career faculty member at my first position at another institution. And when I got to IU, I realized that the guy who had been writing that blog was 4 doors down from my lab. And so I asked him if I could start writing for him. And the first piece I ever wrote at the intersection of science and popular culture was about the evolutionary history of Wookiees. And it coincided with the release of the new Force Awakens Star Wars sort of trilogy. And it was a lot of fun to sort of take what I knew about evolutionary biology and try to explain it to a bunch of Star Wars fans, and using something that was popular to them, and popular to me as well, as another one of those Star Wars geeks. And so that's kind of where I got my start. So in 2017, I really doubled down on that, and I obtained training at the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University as an official trainer in improvisational theater approaches to science communication. Indiana University was an early adopter and an early affiliate of the Alda Center before that program sort of dissolved, the affiliate program sort of dissolved. But we have a huge sort of group of faculty and postdocs and staff here at IU who have been trained at the Alda Center. And so we continue to run that. So we've created in the last 5 years all sorts of science communication workshops, both locally and nationally. I did one recently for the American Association for Anatomy, which is my home institution that was funded and is now regular part of the biennial offerings of the organization. A lot of organizations have really doubled down. I have held training for FASEB as well, as someone who's been involved in policy, science policy for a long time at the national level through the American Association for Anatomy. I helped train the FASEB Science Policy Office how to better communicate with policymakers using applied improvisational theater. And then I used them to help train anatomists how to get better about doing the same thing on Capitol Hill. And so I use all sorts of approaches in social media. Twitter is my big one, but like DP, I am also a podcaster, and that actually sprung out of training with other folks at the Alda Center. And so I host a podcast called Science Night, which is a podcast about the quirky, interesting science that's happening all around us every day, and conversations with scientists who might be our neighbors or might be the people we see at the grocery store every week, but we just don't know because we don't stop to talk to them. So we talk to scientists to figure out what it is that makes them tick, why they're interested in what they do, why they're passionate about what they do, and what sort of things they do that are not science related. Because again, scientists are people and people don't know that. And so we try to bring science to the public by showing that scientists are not monoliths. We are just as quirky and fun and bizarre as everybody else in this world, and we just do some weird stuff as well. And so we're just human, and that's my primary role in social media.
That's awesome. Yeah, I really resonate with your points of like we as a scientist, social scientists, or just working in the STEM field, it's really important to bring, to be able to communicate with the public. And I think the social media platform is a really great ways to really spread out this great knowledge. And I guess here as to my next question is like why, like a lot of students just ask why use social media, right? Like what's like when there's compared to like in-person conference or seminar, right? Why do we need social media to to amplify our work? And do you see any advantages using social medias? Yeah, let's start with Dipti.
So I'm going to say there are a couple of different ways to look at it.
Okay.
From my perspective as an art historian who works on South Asia, and especially I work on Southern India and on art history, and these are very, very narrow fields. Like there are actually 3 art historians who work on the region that I work on Southwestern India, in all of North America. And so I know that I have information that I want to communicate, not just with the academic world, but with a broader audience. And in my role as a historian, especially now when history itself somehow broadly is questioned as like, and anybody can be a historian and they can create their own histories, but at the same time, like history and like, things like CRT, like critical race theory, everything is being questioned and being open to debate. I feel like there is a place, a necessity for historians broadly and humanists broadly to come on social media and talk outside of the academy. And so even as students, I think it is good to cultivate that habit of what is socially responsible thing for an academic to do in the world that we live in now. And that's like bigger than us, bigger than what we can get from social media, but what is it that we as professionals, as academics and scholars need to give through social media to the world around us. So that's one part of it, I think, and it kind of has really defined the way I have used social media in the past few years, is how can I contribute with my own specialization to the public and to generating knowledge, to helping, provide facts in a world where increasingly facts are treated like fiction and questioned, but also new sort of truths are created. So it's a little bit of that. But as a student, I was a PhD student when I started my first podcast, which was a history podcast called Masala History. It's on sabbatical. It'll come back eventually when I have the time. But it was a history podcast where I learned the craft of just doing the podcast by myself. And then I had a website. I still have the website, which is my sort of dissertation research website. And I have over time, because if you Google my name, or if you say Ivory, India, the first thing that will pop up is actually my website, or at least the first page will have at least 4 of my entries from my website pop on, because there are so few people who work on it. So depending on how you want to be seen as a scholar, there is an opportunity that social media creates to actually advertise for you, and and advertise in not sort of like the capitalist sense, but in terms of who you are as a scholar and the kind of work that you do. And as a student in an increasingly competing market, especially in the academic job market, what makes you stand out is what you have put out there. And social media is one way where you can curate your scholarly identity as a student in certain ways. And so if you can use that as, if you want to use that as a part of your sort of scholar persona or an academic persona, there is a good way you can use social media to do that as well. So I'll just stop there and then we can talk more later about that.
Awesome. How about you, Dr. Gunter? What do you think compared to traditional scientific communication, which can be in person or seminars, compared to that, how the social medias, bring out the benefit or advantage of doing scientific communications to the public?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Deepti said about how it is really important for you to establish your own persona, and being on somewhere like Twitter can let you reach people in a way that you would not be able to otherwise. Probably many more people that aren't going to read your papers if you're a scientist. Sorry, everyone, but it's true. So, you can reach out and talk to people in a way that you can't in other ways, and to build your persona, exactly as Deepti said. But I also want to as I mentioned earlier, point out that things have changed a lot. I think there was kind of a golden age of particularly science Twitter in the last 5 years or so. And I think that it's not totally over, but it is very different when, you have lots and lots of fake accounts. I have friends who are in science communication research, and just the amount of bots and fake accounts on Twitter is just always constantly shocking to me, because I curate my Twitter feed, for example, so I don't see a lot of that, but a lot of people do. So I think the value to risk proposition is something that as a student, I think you need to keep in mind more as you're going on to somewhere like Twitter and think about. But I also want to say that I think for me, the last few years, the biggest value of having a social media account is actually listening. I think if you're only broadcasting, then you're not doing it right. You should also be listening to people. And I have heard so many things that have changed the way that I think about even small stuff. Like I posted a fun picture about, oh, here's a hippo, that's my spirit animal, and then actually had someone explain to me why you should not use that term spirit animal, and that's important, which was really great to know, and I did not know that. So that's just a small example, but just I work on autism, for example, interacting with people in the autism community and hearing about what terms they would like to be called. They'd like to be called autistic and not a person with autism, for example. That directly informs my research. So I think listening is really important, and particularly listening to diverse voices that you wouldn't have a chance to listen to otherwise.
I can totally agree with that. A lot of times, even in my research field, I listen to a lot of biologists or other field, they're talking about these new inventions, and then sometimes just give me a spark of creativity and ideas that can really, further of my research, as well as, just let me to think about in different directions. Yeah. So the next, so since Dr. Ganta, you mentioned Twitter, that which I think it's unavoidable to really talk about what happened right now. For many people, including myself, Twitter has become literally a virtual neighborhood, right? It's a place for communities to gather, for people to share their ideas, right? For academics, researchers, it is a platform that exchange ideas, and a platform that you'd be able to listen to a diverse opinions toward certain issues, right? So as we all know, there's a new ownership happening with Twitter recently. So I'm not sure of the panelists, do you have any thoughts about what does this kind of new ownership means for scholars who use Twitter to communicate their scientific work? How about let's start with Dr. Organ.
Yeah, I'm not really sure we have a good answer for this at this point, right? I mean, we are so new into the Elon Musk era of Twitter. However, that said, one of the things that we didn't really talk about in the previous two answers to sort of using social media was the idea that it was network building, right? And so as a faculty member, I helped establish my international reputation that helped me earn tenure easily by connecting with others in my field through Twitter. Prior to the pandemic, when we would, still be at in-person meetings on the regular, meeting someone that you knew from Twitter was exciting and happened all the time. It's like, I've never met you before, but I know you from Twitter, and we've interacted for years on this platform. And so that sense of community is important for reputation building. And that opens doors, right? I mean, that's how you network, especially in a place where, especially time when networking isn't quite as easy as it was, pre-pandemic. So the potential implosion of Twitter is potentially detrimental to science with a capital S, because those networks are going to sort of dissolve. The other thing I kind of wanted to talk about for a second was the fact that we were talking about communicating to the public. And I want to step back for a second and suggest that we never communicate to the public. We communicate with the public. It's a two-way stream of information. And to Chris's point earlier, the best thing you can do is listen. If you're talking and not listening, it's pretty easy to figure out who the jerk is in the room, right? And so, when we communicate with the public, we have to meet them in a place where they are. And that often sets up a power differential, right? So when we communicate with the public, we meet them where we are. And that power differential isn't the same. It isn't set up the same. And so, if, for example, Chris and I are having a conversation, and we're talking about autism, and I don't know anything about autism research. It's not my area of research at all. I know a lot about the human brain because I'm an anatomy professor, but that doesn't mean I know anything about autism or how the brain works even. I just can tell you the names of the parts. In fact, neuroscientists can't always tell you how the brain works. That's part of what makes neuroscience so fascinating. But if we're having a conversation and I have something completely wrong, Chris is trained to say, no, that's not correct. And to then tell me what is correct. We're all trained that way, right? Scientists are trained to stop an argument in its tracks and redirect it. But that's not an effective way to communicate with the public. It's an effective way to stop communicating with the public. Because once someone is told they're wrong, they stop listening. And if they stop listening, they can never have their mind changed. So you have to enter every conversation with the mindset that you're willing to be changed by that interaction. You're willing to have your mind changed based on that interaction. Because if you don't enter into a conversation that way, then it's really not a conversation at all. It is pontificating. It is professing, right? It is proselytizing. It's whatever you want to call it. It's lecturing, but it is not communicating. It is a one-way stream of information. And so to the larger question here, about the potential implosion of Twitter, the communication between scientists and the public is going to be a lot more difficult when it's hard to weigh through all of the noise and get to the actual people behind those accounts. That is becoming more difficult over the last couple of weeks. I don't expect that that's going to change. And so it's going to make the job of science communication much more difficult from the scientist's perspective. And it's going to make the job of science understanding from the perspective of the non-scientist even more challenging as well. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff?
Right. How about you, Dr. Gunter? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I have lots of feelings. I just saw today that someone posted that the lettuce had won and that Elon had decided to appoint a different acting CEO for Twitter. So as Jason just said, none of us know what's going to happen, right? So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think it is regardless of what happens with his tenure, I think, as I think Deepti was saying earlier, I think expertise is something that has been attacked repeatedly. And so I think we're seeing that more and more. And so, as Jason just said, the way to go about not combating that, but kind of trying to work against that is not to lecture everyone all the time, but instead it's to learn a little bit about communication yourselves. Have some training, as Jason said, or as Deepti has done, in terms of looking at science communication, listen to podcasts, try to do a podcast yourself, that kind of stuff. I think, moving to other places besides Twitter is the answer to some extent. And that's a natural evolution.
I actually kind of disagree.
Okay.
And the reason I kind of disagree, I'm sorry, Deepti, not to cut you off from answering.
I was going to also disagree slightly.
Okay, cool.
Perfect.
Great.
So the reason I disagree is because of the character limit at Twitter. It is so effective at making us get better at distilling our messages so that people can understand them, right? It's really hard to write deoxyribonucleic acid, right? But you can write DNA, right? That's many fewer characters. But once you start using jargon, right, or acronyms, you lose your audience. And so we have to get creative about how we discuss what we're talking about without losing that audience and making sure that it's accessible to them. And so I love the Twitter or the character count that is limited on Twitter, because it forces us to be better. But you're right on everything else you've said. I agree with everything else.
Yes, Dr. Gunter, I wasn't disagreeing with anything that you said specifically, just one aspect of this. And we've had this discussion as a DH center where I work. A lot of our work is in public history. So we use digital methods, but we are talking about public history. And so public is a big part of everything that we do. And so one of the discussions that we've had over the last couple of weeks is, what do? We have over 20,000 followers on our center account, where we discuss different projects, bring that to people, interact with people on Twitter, but we also have an Instagram channel. And what do we do with what's happening on Twitter? And one of the things that's come up, like we've said that our job as historians is to communicate with the public and with the public. I'm not saying to the public, but with the public, just so that I can make that clear. But we have to be where the public is, right? So if it doesn't matter which audience you are engaging with over different social media networks, there is your audience. For us, it's the public. And so we have to be where the public is. So until that day comes when people en masse leaves Twitter, like that's the space we as public historians want to be present, because we want to communicate with that core audience group. Now, the core audience group might be different for different social media outlets. Like I use Instagram to do a lot of career diversity conversations. That's how I know Roshni Rao, who's the mastermind of Horizons. So that is a very different group, and I exclusively only communicate with graduate students on my Instagram channel. And that it's a very vibrant community. In fact, my writing groups for my PhD dissertation came out of my Instagram community. I still haven't met any of my writing group members, but we have all graduated like in the last 2 years, and we continue to be in touch with each other. And we've really seen each other through the pandemic, finishing a dissertation through the pandemic. So, so it depends on really the audience. And so, yes, the Twitter question is very important, sort of ethically and politically, but also because it's important ethically and politically, I don't think we as public historians need to abandon Twitter as a space because Musk has gone completely cuckoo. So that's where we kind of stand about thinking of, when you think from the perspective of who your interlocutors are, not necessarily audience, but who you're talking to, I think the use of social media makes more sense that way.
Awesome. Thank you for all your input. So now I just want to shift the topic a little bit to more towards how to properly use the social media, right? For a lot of students who might never had a Twitter account, some researchers that I know, a lot of peers, that they are doing awesome science, but they are just not getting the words out there, right? So like, do you have any recommendations for students who might not have a social media platform such as, podcasts to talk about their science, or a Twitter account or LinkedIn account to talk about their recent discovery of science? Do you have any advice to those students and or people who already have accounts, and what kind of like do's or don'ts on the social media that you could offer the advice of? Let's start with Dr. Ganter.
Sorry, finding the unmute. I'm going to let Jason and Deepti maybe give more tips on that. But the one thing I do say when I talk about this is it's really important to make sure that you understand what your institution's guidelines are as far as social media as a student, because, for example, I was just a professor at Emory University, and the guidelines for faculty were absolutely completely different than the guidelines for medical students. So it is much better to know what those guidelines are before you run afoul of them or are in the enforcement stage if something happens, right? So you definitely want to look those up before you start an account. But as far as tips, there's lots of other people who have written tips out there, so I'll defer to those and I'll let Deepti and Jason talk about tips.
Sure. So I guess the first thing I would say is you have to be cognizant of the fact that the internet is forever, and so when you say something, you need to be sure that it's not just a hot take, right? If you're talking about science, if you're talking about your science, if you're commenting on other folks' science, right? If you're trying to help the public understand science, a hot take is the worst thing you can do. So to that end, you might consider a private, a personal and a professional account, right? To separate those things. I did not do that because my identity as a scientist is so wrapped up in my identity as a person that what you see is what you get, for better and for worse, oftentimes for worse. And I apologize for that, right? I am an avid player of stupid pun games on Twitter, but all of my science contacts get to see that at all times, and thankfully it doesn't turn them off to the point where they unfollow me. But it could very easily annoy someone, or it could be that I'm now muted and my science communication isn't getting out there, right? So you have to be sort of aware that you're wearing one hat in a social media space, even if you'd like to be wearing more than one hat. It's one hat, and so that you got to be careful with when you choose your words. But that said, you also shouldn't be afraid to make a mistake, right? You make a mistake. I like to teach people that there's no such thing as a mistake in science communication. There's just an opportunity to try again, right? If it didn't land the first time, it can land later. The point of science communication is not to shut down a conversation, it's to keep it going. And so, you can say, oh, mea culpa, I was wrong there. I made a mistake. Let me explain why I made my mistake, right? Because maybe your thinking falls in line with that. And maybe that will help you understand why that's a mistake. And why it's a misunderstanding, and can move forward from that. Deepti, you want to add to that?
Yeah, this is something that has horrified me, especially, and I've noticed that people sort of advance through their PhD and then they have this active Twitter presence. And then when you get the final year, they'll all go private. There's a lock symbol next to their account because now they're scared that all the hiring committees or search committees are going to go check out their Twitter, and then they just sort of lock it for a while. But like, it's there. I mean, you can lock it, but it's there. And it's quite possible that, you know, the hiring committee's already seen you rave and rant on Twitter earlier. And that's okay. Like, you know, if that's part of your personality, I think it's okay to show that even to hiring committees. But yes, there is, as Jason pointed out, that there is this problem of you know, what you put out there and who's seeing it, and you have no control when it's a public account. In my case, Twitter is more of like a listening space for me than like, you know, a tweeting space, mainly because I think I want to tweet only if I have things to share. That's of importance. There's enough noise out there on academic Twitter. So I kind of listen in, and it's a tool where I'm learning more than giving on Twitter. But Instagram is the place where I share things that I think graduate students find it helpful and useful. And that's where I give more sort of like suggestions or tips, or I've taken a lot of career diversity workshops, and I was almost thinking that was going to be my secondary career. So, you know, now I don't have anywhere else to, you know, give away that kind of information. So that's a space that I use to communicate really with graduate students and like sort of early career scholars on Instagram. So those are very different. And in my case, instead of having two different accounts, I would say I have two different sort of persona, where Twitter is sort of the listening scholar persona, and the Instagram is where I actually interact with people who are sort of scholars, but also who are academics or in academia, thinking of, you know, not being in academia and, you know, sort of sorting things out. So I kind of divide myself that way. I also have a LinkedIn, but like I hardly use LinkedIn as a space because LinkedIn has evolved in the last few years, and it's been a crazy evolution there as well. So I know a lot of colleagues and friends, especially in the graduate career, professional crowd, who are on LinkedIn, and it's a great space for that kind of work. And I would encourage anybody who's looking for like to be in sort of like quasi-academic or non-academic job tracks, you know, to keep an eye on LinkedIn, because there's a lot happening on LinkedIn that's kind of different from Twitter. And it's a really useful place. Also because you can actually DM people and people will get back to you on LinkedIn more so than on Twitter, because LinkedIn is actively for that kind of network building. And so I've had a lot of informational interviews come through LinkedIn where I have messaged people and said, hey, I'd like to know more about this field. Can you talk to me? And they will get back to me. And I have had the same request come in through LinkedIn as well. So if you are interested in actually relationship building and sort of within a career of your choice that's not quite academic, LinkedIn is a great place too. So in my case, I have worked it out as that there are different personas for different social media, but that's, again, if you really want to partition yourself that way.
Yeah, and I'll just add one tip that we did not get to yet. If you are, to get the second part of your question, Nick, looking to build your Twitter following, I've found a really great way to do that is tweeting from conferences with the conference hashtag, because people really, especially if they use something like TweetDeck, they can follow just a conference hashtag. And that's how I've met a lot of people. So my home society is the American Society of Human Genetics. And I actually started a number of years ago, our first Tweet Up, where we met in person, which the first year was like 10 of us. And last time they had it was like 300 something people. So yeah, it's grown a lot. And a lot of people, as Jason was saying earlier, met through Twitter, right? So definitely using the conference hashtag, people read those, people who are not there read them, and then may reach out to you with questions about stuff they saw. That's been helpful in terms of gaining followers.
I would agree with that. I'd like to add one more thing to that, and that is that to DP's point before about, you know, early career folks who are on the job market setting their accounts to private, you know, it's maybe not a bad move to do that. But again, as DP pointed out, right, they've probably hiring committees have probably already seen whatever it is that you're trying to hide, so it's not really worth hiding it. But nobody, you know, if they're looking for it. But I've been on several hiring committees in my career, and I have never once looked at a candidate's social media. because frankly, that's not, we're not hiring the person for their social media. Now, that said, that has come back to bite Indiana University several times. Not anything that I've been involved with, but it's something that we should probably think through a little bit more carefully as we make hiring decisions with regard to social media or past comments on social media. But what I wanted to point out was that since I earned tenure, my voice on social media has changed. And I think you see that a lot, right? I now have the privilege of tenure on top of whatever privilege I already had. And so I use that to lift up the voices of those who don't have that privilege. And I think you see that a lot with science Twitter, is that as your cohort that you sort of came up with starts to get to those professional levels where they are more secure in their positions, the conversation changes. And that is really useful too, for so many different reasons. Because once you get a cadre of folks who are all aligning their voices to lift up the voices of others who can't lift their own voices or are unable to lift them up in the same way, science, Twitter just continues to flourish. And so I think that's true on all of the social media accounts, at least the ones where you can write. Instagram is not as much a writing social media platform as it is a picture writing platform. But I know that there are plenty of people who use it very differently. But
I am completely disagreeing with that. I write a lot on Instagram as well. So I'm going to.
But the point is, that's totally fair. And the point is, I imagine that you've probably seen similar kinds of things over there, right? Is that as cohorts move through that have been united through their social media interests and communities, that the communities turn over and the voices, the types of voices that individuals have within those communities changes over time. And that's really interesting to watch.
Right. Yeah, I agree. So with that, we still have a few minutes, and then we do have a questions from our Hoover app. So this audience want to ask about how and on what content do you communicate over social media over a daily basis when the research turnaround is usually in years in scale. Anyone want to answer that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a great question. So let me make sure I got that. So the question was, research usually takes years. So how do you, social media is more instant. So how do you do that?
Right.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's really important for me to celebrate milestones as they come along. So we just had our big symposium here at the Human Genome Institute, and I had 3 postdocs for the first time presenting posters. So I feel like a real PI now. It's very exciting. So, stuff like that. We have a paper that's coming out on the 22nd. So I'm already writing a tutorial for that to kind of put things out. So I think, yeah, just using things like tutorials, like, pictures of symposium or pictures giving posters. I think that's how I do it, is marking the milestones along the way.
That's awesome. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Maybe you can type in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. All right, I guess yeah, that's toward the end of sections. If there's no more questions, I really appreciate this engaging conversation with all of you today. I want to thank the entire team of Horizons to have in this conference to really communicate your work to the public, with the public, 2 ways. Yeah. So I want to thank Dr. Gunter, Dr. Organ, and Deepthi again for your time be here with us today. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, to join today's section. And then we do have a lot more other sections in Horizons today and tomorrow. So just feel free to chime in to other sections to join. And yeah, with that, thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.